All right, welcome everybody. Out of respect to our panelists, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining today. I hope it is a lovely spring or early summer day wherever you are. So welcome to today's SAAL structured conversation. This session is being recorded and closed captioning is available. My name is Tori Rare. I'm a member of SAAL's Professional Learning and Development Committee, and I'd really like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. So a couple of things about structured conversations. This is a monthly offering from SAL to feature different perspectives on student affairs assessment. If you have a topic that you're interested in proposing, we will share a link in the chat. Please feel free to fill out that proposal. We also will talk more about it at the end, but we do have a structured conversation scheduled for June as already. I encourage folks to register for that. So during this presentation, we invite you to participate by asking questions and sharing comments, providing feedback through the chat function. We'll be monitoring that throughout, and we will have time for some question and answer at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our moderator and our panelists. They'll introduce themselves and then share their thoughts on using skills from student affairs assessment to advance to senior leadership positions. I will go ahead and turn things over to Ania to get us started.
Thank you so much, Tori. I want to thank SAIL for giving us the opportunity to present, as well as all our audience members today. So I'll be starting to share my screen of the PowerPoint. So I think the first thing we want to do is to introduce ourselves. So I'm Ania Peczalska. I'm the Director of Institutional Effectiveness at the University of Kentucky. I've been in assessment, including student affairs assessment, for over 10 years. I'll be serving as the moderator, and then I'll ask my colleagues who are joining us in the presentation, maybe from left to right, to introduce themselves, and they feel comfortable kind of talking about their assessment background as well.
Hey everyone, my name is Dan Bureau. I am the Associate Vice President for Student Wellbeing here at the University of Kentucky. I've worked in higher ed for 28 years and started my student affairs assessment time after completing my postdoc at Indiana University, where I'd also worked at the National Survey of Student Engagement, worked at the University of Memphis as the Director of Student Affairs Assessment from 2011 to 2016, and then supervised that position for the last 3 years that I was there. So looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you today, and certainly an appreciation for all of my friends here in SAL land. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maia. I work at the University of Tampa. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs Program Effectiveness. And basically, my role is mainly assessment, working with all of our student affairs departments and our Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students as well. So I've been in higher ed for 15 years. My background is actually in leadership education and development, and then assessment was always a special home. And now it's a major part of my role here.
Good afternoon. My name is Dayna Weintraub. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as an Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, focused on assessment, strategy, and planning. Within my portfolio, it includes assessment, as well as student affairs marketing and communications, development, and parent and family engagement. And I will have been at Rutgers for 10 years as of August. And previous to coming to Rutgers, I was at UCLA for 13 years in various different student affairs roles and pursuing my PhD in higher education organizational change, at which time I had also worked in student affairs assessment.
All right, thank you, everyone. We'll move on to the next slide. So before we dive too much into our presentation, I wanted to take the time to introduce Strine-Patterson's model. This is a multi-level assessment process, which also, as you can see from left to right, we have divisional leaders with bigger level things. They're thinking, of course, at the high level divisional leaders. We're moving also to departmental leaders, which is kind of the middle. And as you see, there's a big overlap between the two, where department leaders are segueing between the divisional level of the assessment cycle, but then they're going more into the department level as well. And as you can see, also, I wanted to mention the assessment cycle, which I'm sure everyone in the virtual room is familiar with. We have divisional educational and operational plans that go to kind of goals, outcome, objectives. We talk about maybe transitioning, at least in this level, to education operational plans. Then, of course, you're going to get the results from the assessment cycle. Then you're going to talk about planning and start the whole thing over again. But I think what I wanted to mention as you see this multi-level assessment plan is that you're just not planning for one level. You can be planning for other levels as well. So then when we start moving from the division leaders to departmental leaders, we go to that bottom level, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, the student affairs, which is the educators. For example, we have a departmental educational operational plans, we have plan-based informed strategies, plan measurement and data collection. We also implement strategies and measurements, analyze data and statistical results, as well as interpret results and identify improvement opportunities. So before we get more into presentation, I just have a question if you feel comfortable putting it in the chat, just so we can learn a little bit more about who's in the room. Can you please share how many years of student affairs assessment you have, just so we get a sense of people in the room? Okay, so just looking here, we got 8, 6, 2, 2, 10, 1. So we have a variety. Fantastic. So it looks like people in this room, we do have student affairs background, and some of it is within assessment, but then some of it is in other areas as well. So we just wanted to get a sense of who is in the room a bit before we move on the presentation, but I'm sure that you might be familiar with this model, but also the importance in involving many people in assessment as well. Okay, so I was very fortunate to partner with Dan Burrow, who's on this call, with a special assessment study. So our question was basically is what skills and student affairs assessment can help when you get to that senior leadership level in student affairs, such as assistant vice president, even up to vice president in student affairs. So we had the privilege of interviewing 7 student affairs senior leaders last 2 Decembers ago, almost. And then we decided to do a thematic analysis, and we had the opportunity to publish in the spring 2025 NASPO Leadership Exchange magazine. So part of our panel today is actually going to be framed around the study, which is also tied to the Strine-Patterson model of this interweavedness within the Division of Student Affairs. That assessment is not just one person's job, rather it's kind of the entire division's job. So we have 8 different skills that we're going to be discussing in our panel today. But before we dive in and let our panelists share experiences, I just wanted to take the moment to really go a little bit through 8 skills that Dan and I identified in our study. So the first is data-based decision making. This is not only using data to make decisions, but it's also helping often in student affairs assessment roles, producing data for decision making. Example is you can explain data to others and help others also understand the value of data. The second skill I want to bring to your attention is interpersonal communication. And this is not just only being able to talk to others, but being clear and consistent, and not only talking to one audience, but to a variety of stakeholders. So for example, if I'm sharing results from a study, I might be speaking to a department director in student affairs in one way, but then if I'm talking to the senior leader of the division or other leaders across the institution, I'll be speaking in a different way. So this interpersonal communication is very important. Demonstrating curiosity. I'm assuming that many of you in this room are curious about assessment, and that's maybe why you're joining us today. But it's not only learning new things, it's kind of learning from others of a learning mindset. For example, asking questions to learn more about student affairs initiatives, helping others make meaning of student affairs initiatives and assessment results. Sense making is related to number 3, but it's kind of taking it a step further. It's helping others making meaning of data, as well as articulate the findings. You can ask questions that help student affairs staff apply findings for improvement as well. Strategic thinking is the next skill. And this is actually focusing on strategic initiatives where you're tying the assessment information you collect to these bigger goals, but then also think about long-term goals. Example is in a former student affairs assessment director, one of the things I was focused on is how can I enhance the willingness to engage in assessment and also understands importance. So that's kind of more of long-term strategic thinking. Next skill is advocacy. So this is advocating, often using data and assessment professionals for more resources for yourself and others. And the good thing about the data is perhaps that can help strengthen your case. If you're showing data, for example, you need more resources in this area, that makes a stronger case for those additional resources. Second to last is problem solving, where you would, as an assessment professional or a senior leader, resolve issues. You often can resolve it with data and extra information from your assessment background. And finally, leading without authority. Often assessment directors do manage staff who are not direct reports. And if you're not having direct reports, it's a different level of dynamics. So the question then, of course, is how can you go and lead others who are not your direct report, engage them and empower them to use assessment? So I want to turn it over to my panelists, starting with Anna, kind of explain a story about their background using some of the skills I just mentioned.
Sure, thanks, Anya. Yeah, so I could see a lot of these at play, all of them actually. But one of the examples I'm going to share is something that happens quite frequently. I mean, I'm going to share a specific example about it, but really thinking about how skills such as interpersonal communication, strategic thinking, and the database decision making really inform how your career can develop further and are super important as you look at those senior level positions. So one of the most recent examples is I was working with our executive director of residence life who reached out to me. She had had a data request to share data on some housing numbers and was quite concerned about how to report the data, mainly due to like the timestamp of when the data was being collected and also was it going to showcase her area in a negative light, right? So really critically thinking about who's receiving the data, what does that look like, right? What is the audience really looking for, and is that the best way that you can be communicating what is happening in your department? So really the goal is to bridge that gap between what's happening in your department and then how do you communicate that up to the president or board of trustees level and what are they looking for? And the interpersonal communication really came at play for us. I personally reached out to our vice president for student affairs to really see what she was looking for in the data set and understanding the why. Why is the board looking for this? Why is the president? What do you want to communicate to them? And then talking to our executive director again about her needs and what she was hoping to showcase through the data. It really helped us understand what data we should collect. What does that look like on her end? And then communicating that back up. So kind of the strategic thinking that comes into play in making these decisions and really understanding what you're going to present, I think is a really important skill to have. And again, going back to that interpersonal communication of like, what is the why here? Why did they want this? And what's the ultimate goal here?
All right, thank you, Anna. Let's go on to our next panelist, Dayna, for her story.
Yes. So leading without authority really resonates for me. When I came to Rutgers, I came as a person of a department of one, with the charge of establishing a student affairs research and assessment program. So I was one person, didn't have resources to hire anyone else to support me, but had a big task ahead of me to establish this culture of assessment. And so it really required really being able to bring people in the value of assessment and the importance of everyone doing an assessment and what that means. And so a good example of leading without authority is our annual reporting process, which I established. And I would say, I had a handful of people who, of departments, directors who, recognize the importance of annual reporting and was really excited for this to be established. And then I had some people who were resistant, were concerned it was, additional time, lack of resources, what's going to be done with the information, et cetera. And then, folks in the middle. My need of how do I get people on board with this process? How do I, ensure that directors are going to turn in these reports without having any authority or over accountability? And so it's about relationship building, and it's also about really establishing what's the utility of the ask. And then where advocacy comes in is when you have these reports, how can you use the information in the reports to advocate for the resources that you need to support your work?
All right, thank you, Dana. Let's go on to Dan now.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the fact that over 28 years of higher education, these three skills actually show up throughout my time. What I'll say as a director of student affairs assessment from 2011 to 2016, they showed up every single day. Spent the first 10 years of my career working in a functional area. I worked in fraternity and sorority life, did a lot of work within student organizations, campus life kind of side of the student affairs division. And so went into my PhD full time, worked at the Center for Postsecondary Research, administered the NESI survey. But going into my first director of student affairs job, I still had to build credibility with the people that were doing functional areas that I really had not had a lot of interactions with. I had done partnerships as a campus life practitioner, but end of the day, I wasn't going to walk into the student health center or our counseling center and really be able to have any kind of credibility with them because I didn't come from their backgrounds. And so I had to really demonstrate a level of curiosity with each of those individuals in order to make sure I asked the right questions, the questions that mattered in order to help them develop outcomes. Around that 2011, 2012 time is when you saw a lot more divisions of student affairs wrestling with how we document student learning and development. That late 2000s into the early 20 teens was really a period where I think the field of student affairs assessment was driven by that. And you're talking about units that historically had not had a lot of push towards that. So for me to help them identify their outcomes and do it in a way that could be of interest to our vice president as well as other publics, I had to ask the questions around their functions. And I'll say that that actually helps me very much now, sitting in the position of being an associate vice president for well-being, second job I've had in this kind of lane of well-being previously at LSU. So I think listening and asking questions and demonstrating a real commitment to hearing them was a really important skill set that I developed then that helped me become an AVP. The sense making was really important as well. How do I help departments that don't necessarily care a lot about data interpret their data and figure out what it means for the delivery of their programs and services? And then how do I help them solve the problems that they need to? A separate example, but that happened around 2014, is we had a new president at the University of Memphis. My VP had brought me in onto her leadership team, and she asked me to enact a service quality initiative for the entire institution focused on 6 different areas. These were areas that were outside of student affairs, but there was a real perception that they were not providing high-level services to our students. The bursar, financial aid, admissions. Like these are services that often get a lot of criticism around the fact that one or two bad interactions and then it blows up on a parent's page or whatever. And so I had to help us develop at the divisional level, but also with respect to the goals of our new president, how do we solve the problem of high level service quality at our institution? And I had to go to those departments and ask them questions because if I just went in there and said, here's our assessment instruments, we're going to ask people what they think about your services and then gave them no courtesy of explaining, well, what really drives these services? What are the service provider models that you're enacting that need to be kind of looked at as we look at this data? They would have just been like, well, you don't really understand what we're trying to do here, regardless if the president wanted it or not. And so these three skills during that period of time when I was an assessment director really did help me create credibility with other departments, with my colleagues, both within student affairs, but also throughout the institution. And that ability to help people solve problems as a result of having that data is really key. And I think when you get to the point of being an associate vice president, an assistant vice president, when you're part of a president or vice president's leadership team, that problem solving potential is huge. And that's what they pay you the big bucks for, is to show up and solve the problems both within your areas, but also across the division.
Thank you, Dan. So now we're going to switch focus and we're going to be asking just 3 general questions for our panelists before transitioning to our Q&A part of the presentation. But before we do that, I just want to bring up this slide again. I know we've all seen it, but we decided that we actually want to bring this back because this is kind of underlying many of the questions and answers we'll be speaking about and showing the interdependence of assessment within the Division of Student Affairs. So let me go and ask a first question for our panelists today. What are common gaps you see when staff aspire to senior level roles, particularly around assessment, data storytelling, or strategic thinking? And how can mid-level professionals intentionally build those skills? And I'll also put this in the chat for our participants because I know that's a long question.
So when I think about this one of the things that I feel like has been really beneficial in my career is really thinking about the aesthetics of presenting data and storytelling. So everything that I work on, I make sure it's pretty and it stands out. It's kind of having that like marketing mindset. And when you're showcasing, so whether it be an impact report or even if it's just like a one pager that you're producing or an email that you're sending out with specific bullets. And so really thinking about the marketing of that and how that's showing up, I think is really important. And if that's not your skill set, because I've worked with different leaders that maybe that's not their skill set, they don't really have an eye for that. It's empowering others on your team to be able to do that for you. And I know that's been really beneficial for our Vice President of Student Affairs here is she really appreciates having a glossy kind of impact report, right, to share with potential donors or whatever that might be. So that's always been really, really helpful for me in my career and has helped me, kind of move up. And then the other element I want to share too is really ethically thinking about how to use data to leverage your work, right? So I know Dayna mentioned the annual reporting. For us, the CAS program reviews have also been very beneficial for areas in terms of like advocating improvements. There have been several areas on our campus that have really, pushed for more staff, right? That's the big thing in student affairs. We would like more staff. And so the CAS program reviews have been really beneficial. So whenever I'm working with folks that have that innate fear of like, why am I getting evaluated in this way? Really talking to them and working through like the advocacy component that is a benefit from actually highlighting your challenges and being transparent about what your needs are can really help you move that needle forward and have something to present for upper leadership that, you really need more staff or you need to expand your facilities or whatever that might be.
So how I would approach, thank you, Anna. How I would approach this, how I think about this question is excuse me, I sometimes kind of have the misconception, or so I feel that there's a misconception that, and I don't mean this in a negative or disrespectful way in any way, but just because someone has a doctorate does not necessarily mean that they're practicing those tools of the research process on a daily basis. So what I mean by that is, the folks that I report to or the folks that I'm trying to, convince or, work with, develop relationships with, all of my, senior colleagues, for example, they have doctorates. They know and understand the research process. They have experience with the research process, but they're not necessarily doing it on a daily basis. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes I'll be in conversations where it's, we're trying to solve a problem or, there's a decision that needs to be made. And so we want to identify, what's the sources of evidence to help us reach the conclusions. And what I find a skill that I try to bring to the table that I draw from my assessment background is how do we identify what's the outcome, what are the questions that we're seeking to answer, and what are the data sources to answer those questions. So sometimes I find where here's the problem and the context, but then the questions and the information that we're trying to gather are not necessarily related, or the method in which we're trying to answer the question is not related. So sometimes I feel like it's, what I'm trying to bring to the table is let's get back to the basics of really identifying what's the outcome, how do we measure it, is it realistic, what's the question that we're trying to answer, here are the sources of data that we have to support it. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is when we do have data and information that we're trying, whether survey results is a good example, and we're trying to identify what's the message here. I'm trying to kind of be that voice at the table, wanting to make sure that we're answering those questions ethically, but also true to the data. So we're not exaggerating and interpreting things based on what we're hoping and wanting for, but truly sticking to being objective and communicating what the data tells us.
I'll add, and Dana said something there too that stands out to me. I do think that directors of student affairs assessment often find themselves positioned as that mid-level, though there have been individuals certainly who build out a level of institutional kind of awareness, institutional collaborations, et cetera, that elevate who they are in that position. And they're actually distinctively and you they're distinctively positioned to take all the information that you get and make the best sense of it for a vice president or for a director or for another institutional leader, right? What I will say sometimes, I think one of the gaps I find might be that when we are so buried in the process of collecting and interpreting data, we don't necessarily know how to take that and scale the message to tell the stories in ways that allow an AVP or a vice president to really apply that across multiple objectives, multiple priorities, multiple functional areas. And so sometimes the gap might be that we're too mired in the work of data, but not necessarily strong enough in the how do we turn this into a vice president's priority list. I think there's lots of people that do that really well. I think that is a gap, though, that sometimes I think could emerge, particularly not just at assessment professionals, but if you think about the types of people that land at mid-level management, they tend to excel at the functional area and may want to collaborate, but may not have strong understandings of the areas around them. I think because of the nature of the consultant work that a student affairs director does, assessment director does, they are least inclined to do that, but they also might be kind of too mired into the function.
Thank you, panelists, for your response. The second question I'll put in the chat and read out loud as well is if you could give one piece of advice to student affairs professionals who want to, yeah, sorry about that. When hiring or promoting into senior roles, what evidence of assessment related skills signals to you that a candidate is ready to operate at the AVP level?
Yeah, I'll start off on that one. So AVPs are tasked with a number of things. We tend to have to enact the directives of our vice president, but also lead initiatives that really benefit the maybe cross-functional work that our directors do. So, for example, in the well-being area, my task is to take my six directors and figure out among all of you what are the things that emerge as priorities, not only for the wellness area or the counseling area, but that for all of us. And I do think that there are a number of skills that you learn. I think all of the eight that we talked about earlier on play out well at the AVP level. But I think if you're trying to figure out what prepares someone to be an AVP is how well can you assess the delivery of effective and efficient operations, and how can you take that data in order to enact operations that are effective and efficient? I think the people that are best positioned to lead at the AVP level or at a leadership level, whatever the structure is at that institution, have a lot of practice in doing that. Again, that's why people on this call could be very well positioned there because you do have practice as the Director of Student Affairs Assessment. I think also that AVPs often have to think about the collaborative and shared work and to do things not only efficiently and effectively, but also that help us get at what are the real priorities of higher education and in facilitating student success. What are those common goals? So for me, when I think of hiring people into roles that are like mine, that come through the background of working in student affairs assessment, and many of us have come through either this angle of like, we came up through a functional area, we came up through institutional effectiveness, we came up through some kind of research. Many of us do have a doctorate or advanced degree, possibly even an MBA. But you think about those kind of educational credentials. I think that those credentials really kind of feed into this idea that you are best ready to lead when you're able to take all that information and figure out the most effective ways to lead efficiently, effectively, collaboratively, while using the data that you have in order to do all of that.
Do any other panelists want to jump in for this question? All right, let's move on then to the last. So the last question is, if you could give one piece of advice to student affairs professionals who want to advance to the AVP level, specifically related to assessment and skill development, what would it be? And what would you do differently if you were starting today?
So one piece of advice that I would have is, and it somewhat relates to, I think there's a question about how to integrate the institution level assessment leaders into the process. So I think that my answer might cover that question too. I would try to get yourself involved in some institution university-wide committees, because it allows an opportunity to develop relationships with other university partners, provides information to really align your experiences with institutional goals. And I know for me, I have, especially given student affairs assessment is a very small unit. I have found it very, very important and beneficial for me to really work very closely with other assessment colleagues across the institution. One from kind of a community perspective, but also from a resource sharing and expertise, knowledge community type perspective too. So I work closely with our enrollment analytics office, work closely with my counterpart in assessment in undergraduate education, and then we also have a data strategy position in our office of the chancellor. So I feel like, and institutional research too, like I feel like I've kind of created kind of a nice community for myself that has helped me better position student affairs assessment, obtain the data and the support that I need to do the work, as well as involving faculty. And then I think it also provides an opportunity to also learn from your colleagues on effective skills to be able to, whether it be advocate, problem solve, and really, identify what the needs are to support the student experience.
All right. Well, we also have some questions in the chat, so we want to move it over to the Q&A, and I want to thank again our panelists for their time and sharing all their experience today. So I'm just going to kind of go up to the first question I see and just ask our panelists to respond. So the first question we get is, how do you integrate the institutional level assessment leaders into the process?
Could you go back, Anya, and look at the 8 skills? I'd like to infuse those into my response to that.
Of course.
I know that you and I, Nicole Long, we're currently working on a book chapter for Sean Bourne, who's on the call today, his book with Renee. But what I will say is that when engaging in collaborations outside of student affairs, when you're talking more from an institutional effectiveness perspective, I really can't stress enough about how these 8 skills actually show up in those kind of interinstitutional collaborations, right? Inter, correct me if I'm, whichever one that was, right? But if you think about it, this demonstrating curiosity, people in student affairs might be pigeonholed into the lane of student services, where maybe someone in institutional effectiveness is looking more in other areas. How do you demonstrate curiosity in terms of what they're doing so that they reciprocate that and truly come to understand the value and benefit of student affairs to the collective institutional priorities, right? Or how do you show up as a person that is trying to make sense of the priorities that the IE director is enacting, even if they don't feel necessarily like they're going to drive priorities in your division? But how do you show up as someone that can help interpret that in those conversations with other institutional leaders, but also then push that up and down to your VP and then to other people in the division about what matters most to the institution. So I think when you are trying to get other people across institutional involved, other people across the institution involved, it's really about showing up as a team player, as a committed colleague, as someone that is curious and wants to not only advance your goals but theirs. Ask more questions than give answers. Ask more questions and advocate for what you're there for, because at the end of the day, they will understand that you're invested in them and want to help them be successful in what they're trying to work on.
I kind of want to echo because my position now is actually an institutional level assessment leader, and I also used to be a director of student affairs assessment, so I have personal experience in both areas. I will definitely agree with Dan. But again, just offering first to meet with them, I think is very effective. When I started at University of North Carolina, Wilmington as my director of student affairs assessment, one of the first things I wanted to do was to meet the IE director, just let her know I'm here, learn more about what she's doing, like what Dan said, the curiosity and demonstrating curiosity, building that relationship, but also strategically thinking. For example, if there was a big initiative I was going to do, sometimes I would check in with her to see if there was data, or if I was doing a campus-wide survey, which I was doing for undergraduate students, again, checking with her for input. So like Dana is saying, showing you're a team player and then also getting them involved in some of your projects as well, but also donating your time needed to them as well. So the next question we got for our panelists is, do any of your institutions have an assessment fellows program? We have one at Bergen CC in New Jersey that broke the departments SS/SA and ACAD between 7 fellows stipend role. It would be wonderful. It is wonderful. Excuse me, I miss it.
We don't have anything like that here. It sounds like really great. So we have a student affairs assessment committee, and that's been really beneficial, especially for data sharing across departments. So folks volunteer to be on the committee. I chair it, and it's been really great to collaborate and enhance assessment initiatives by having these like leaders from each department represented on it. So we do make sure that the makeup of our committee is really diverse. So that's been really fun.
I'm not familiar with an assessment fellows program, but I am in New Jersey, so I would love to hear more. But one of the approaches, we have an assessment committee as well, with representation from each department. And then how, excuse me, what I've also tried to do is establish relationships with faculty in education statistics, and work closely with those faculty to help identify prospective graduate students, who it would be kind of a mutually beneficial relationship for the student as well as fulfilling some of the analysis needs for our unit.
All right, we have one more question for our panelists. How do you approach or think about data collection or presentation differently, if at all, from when you were in assessment focus role?
I think about this a lot, and what I will say is that I always felt like an imposter as a student affairs assessment director because I actually really didn't care about generating data. And my B's in my doctoral programs were my stats classes. And there's lots of things that can generate those numbers for you. For me, the more compelling part of that work was helping people make sense of it and applying it in order to improve practice. And so, what I would say about my current beliefs around presentations is, and this is a very weedy thing, but I feel like people that spend time going through the N, the demographics, the means, those kind of things, that could be a little QR code that is a handout. I think most people at senior levels just want to hear your interpretation of the big findings and some recommendations. Those recommendations should be vetted with other leaders, right? I would never walk into a room and not have informed my VP about what I'm going to say, especially if it's something that might expose institution to risk, or even more so, like, maybe present that a program is underperforming or ineffective. So what I will say though is that the amount of attention span people have nowadays if you only have an hour, I would make all the details and the methodology a handout, and I would dive more into the concepts, the constructs, and what it is that you all want to work on, and engaging people in that room and making sense of the data. The sense making piece is really huge.
All right, we have another question for our panelists. What are some ways that you have found helpful to change the mind of folks who don't seem to really value assessment, especially those in higher leadership positions?
This is a tough one. I feel like I'm working a lot towards this in my role. And sometimes it's literally like offering. I find it really helpful when you offer data or offer it in a very digestible form where for them they can really advocate for their needs, right? So really showing that. Or one of the things that's worked really well is working with a department and showcasing their work, like, look what they have done with this, you can do it too, right? So kind of showing how it's been successful in other areas, or like piloting something with an area so then you can show how that data worked really well and they served as an example and role model has been helpful for me in my career.
So I don't know that I've necessarily encountered where um, institutional leaders are not valuing assessment. I think it's more similar to some of the things that I said previously, where it's like trying to really kind of hone in on like what the assessment is that's needed. So I feel like I've been pretty fortunate that I feel like I think the other thing too that I encounter a lot is making sure that there's alignment between words and behaviors. So I think sometimes we say things, but our actions are not necessarily congruent with it. And so that's why I try to kind of temper some of the really nice, pretty ways of, evidence-based decision making and, things like that, where it's like, let's not use those words. Instead, like, what are the examples that we're showing? So it's like behave first and then describe how you were behaving, as opposed to put the words down on paper and then try to make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing.
I think this will depend on your institutional kind of structuring of student affairs assessment priorities, and that's determinant of the president, the vice president, the provost, et cetera. When I was doing the work day to day, I told people that I was a consultant and I could show up of one of five ways, right? Basically looking at the assessment cycle, the continuous improvement cycle, how do you need me to be showing up to help you? I would not do all five for you, but I would do some for you and all of it with you. And I think sometimes departments just need help in clarifying their outcomes. That's where the demonstrating curiosity comes into play, right? How do you ask questions to help understand the functional areas so they can figure out the priorities they need to enact? Or if you want to create the right interventions, right? So, how do you strategically think about what it means to prioritize time, resources, finances, all that kind of stuff in order to help a department do that. But I do think that when you show up as a person that's invested in helping them accomplish all the aspects, and then I think that was when you kind of win some people over. I've said this a few times recently, and it's no shade to the concept of assessment. I think we would be better off, though, in calling the work we're doing continuous improvement. Our director of assessment here at University of Kentucky for Student Success was just rebranded as organizational effectiveness. I think that's a wonderful way to think about the work. I think because people get so mired in the methodology, and most people in student services work don't necessarily come into this work in order to kind of create surveys and protocols. So, but they do want to think creatively about how to enhance the delivery of their programs and services. So I think we could actually stand a refresh and a rebrand, but also the active assessment, the methods behind that is important as we enact our work. So yeah, I think I would stop there. I think that we can help people understand that we are more than just trying to force them to do a methodology, but really to rethink how a program or service might be better developed or enhanced for our students and our stakeholders.
Thank you. There's one more question in the chat. Do you use anything other than chat LOL to decide on graphics for different data points? I love a table and bar graph, but a one pager needs more character. Presentations are so important.
I don't. Personally, I mean, I really just use Excel and Qualtrics a lot. But Canva has been interesting for like more the infographic side of things if you want to do something like that instead just to represent different sort of data. So yeah.
So I've used Canva and some of the Adobe Express products, and our marketing team uses the Adobe Express products as well. I would say, and I might be taking the question in a different direction. Um, Stephanie Evergreen, she has a number of books on visualization that I've worked closely with to get ideas, and just also think about the optimal ways of graphically and visually representing the type of depending on what the type of data is.
Darby also has a recommendation in the chat, and I just do whatever Darby Roberts tells me to do. So I would definitely read that book.
And the book, for those of you who can't see the chat, is Dykes B 2020 Effective Data Storytelling, How to Drive Change with Data, Narrative, and Visuals.
I will say I've become lazy. I actually have fallen prey more to AI tools. So it's interesting. I don't know how I would have answered that question 10 years ago, other than maybe find a book or something like that. But really good question. Very compelling one at this point in time.
All right, so I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I will leave it open for anybody if any last minute questions you might have for our panelists today. I'll have one more question actually for our panelists. If there's one piece of advice you would give for those in this room who maybe want to aspire to those senior level positions, what would be your one piece of advice that they could take home and start working on today?
I mean, I think the advice I would have is first think about what your why is. Why do you aspire to be in that role? And then think about like journaling about the skills and the experiences that you currently have and continue to cultivate those strengths. And then also seek out an opportunity to have a conversation with someone who is in that role, to learn more about their experiences, and seek advice from them. And then I think it's a matter of thinking about ways, how do you create that bridge to that role? And what are some of those experiences that you want to try to seek out, and then think about some of the pathways to seek those experiences out.
Around the same lines as what Dana was saying, I was thinking about, really finding, if you haven't found a mentor in a while, that is a role that you aspire to be, or someone in a different campus, reaching out and having that kind of contact for what's next for you. I think that's one of the best tools. I think I attended a panel at ACPA or NASP or something a while back that they suggested to always keep, higher ed jobs open. And so that's something I've done throughout my career, is always keep that flowing in so I can read other positions, what's required of those positions, what I'm missing, and what I really aspire for my next move. It's been really helpful to kind of keep that open and look at those position descriptions throughout my career. So continue to do that.
Tori and I were talking after the last SAAL structured conversation, which kind of focused on this premise, right? Like, how do you aspire to that kind of a role? And I struggled a little bit with our content in that session because it is perfectly wonderful for someone to aspire, but also it's also wonderful for someone to just want to elevate the work in the current position that they're doing. And there are certainly people in the assessment world that have elevated everything that they've done, every role they've had, may have stayed at the same institution, yet they've also found ways to challenge themselves, put themselves in different positions across the institution, within the division, those kinds of things as well. So I do want to say that I think that as we aspire to something, what we call like up the org chart, it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be better for us. And that while we're doing the work that we are doing in this role, or whatever role we have, we should really aspire to excel and develop those skills that Dayna talked about in particular. The one thing I will say, I do think that reaching out and reaching out and asking other people for help in identifying what it would take for you to get there, having mentors is wonderful. I also think it's not a bad idea to figure out what it would look like to do this work in somewhere outside of higher education. Because I do think that sometimes the advancement might have to come by leaving higher ed because you're geographically bound, you might have a partner, those kinds of things, right? Because there are opportunities to take the skills you're doing in this work, the continuous improvement, the organizational effectiveness, the measurement, those kinds of skills, and do it in a different venue as well. So maybe it's not always about moving up in higher ed to that AVP or VP role, but it might be about moving into a different type of context with a higher level of responsibility where these skills can be transferred as well. Lots of thoughts there. I was a little bit all over the map there, but I do think it's important that we think about the fact that sometimes staying in the role is awesome. Sometimes aspiring to the role in the institution is awesome, but sometimes leaving and doing something different could be awesome as well.
Thank you, everyone. I'll give maybe a few more seconds in case we have any more moments and questions in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. All right, in that case, thank you so much. I want to go to our final slide. We have all 4 of our contact information. If you want to reach out this after our presentation, please feel free. I want to thank you again for your time today, all the audience members, and again, SAAL, for giving us this opportunity to present. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks everybody so much for being here. As we wrap up, let's give our speakers a virtual round of applause, let's say. And a huge thank you to our panelists and our moderator for taking time out of their schedule to be with us today. I know it's a wild time of the year with commencement and such, so really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules. A recording of today's session, along with any resources, will be shared via email and available on SAAL's website within the next week or so. We hope to see you at our next structured conversation. I put the link in the chat. This one's going to be really fun. It's going to be a discussion about a collaborative research project across SAAL, NASPA, and ACPA, looking at analysis of SAAL listserv threads. So we're going to be talking about the methodology as well as the actual results for that. And Dr. Sean Boren's going to be leading that, or along with Sarah LaFrance and Dr. Renee Delgado-Riley. So thanks everybody for joining us. Again, please visit the SAAL Structured Conversation webpage to see our upcoming offerings and to submit your own proposal. This session was actually a proposal that was submitted via the website, so those are absolutely welcome, and we highly encourage folks to submit. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and I will close down the Zoom shortly thereafter. Thanks again, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.